Welcome to Our Girl Relationships. We talk about the problems people face in their day to day lives. Let's start with the video. My entitled aunt has literally risked my life because she's jealous that my grandparents love me more than her son, even though I'm adopted. Now she's begging for my forgiveness. Let me give you some context first because my aunt has been a truly miserable person for quite some time now. So, my mom is the youngest of two siblings. She has an older sister. Her older sister, or my aunt, is actually quite a bit older than my mom. They have an age gap of about 12 years. My aunt got married when she was around 22 because she was pregnant. She has a son who grew up to be a problematic kid, to say the least. By the time he was in his early teens, he was involved with some bad groups around the city and had done a few rounds of juvie. Understandably, it was a topic of some discomfort among the family. Let me also just say that my grandparents are quite wealthy. Nana comes from old money, and my pop made a lot of money from his business. I'm mentioning this because it's quite important to the story. My aunt is a single mother, and my grandparents have paid for pretty much every expense of hers. But when my cousin refused to get his act together and my aunt was not strict enough with him, they cut them off financially to teach them a lesson. This was when my cousin was around 19. Coming back to my parents now. My mom got married when she was 23, and after 5 years of trying to have a baby, Dad and her decided to adopt me. I was 2 years old when I was adopted. I feel very lucky to say that my family has been nothing but loving to me. My parents have doted on me for as long as I've known them, and so have my grandparents. Oh, I forgot to mention that I was adopted right around the time when my grandparents cut my aunt and cousin off. This is also important to the story. My grandparents absolutely loved me and still do. No one ever made me feel bad about being adopted, and I never really felt I wasn't a part of the real family. They told me that I'm adopted when I was 12 and said I can search for my birth family if I wanted to, but I didn't want to and still don't. So, around a year after I was adopted, my aunt was babysitting me one day and she took me to a park. We live in a very small town and there are woods at the outskirts of town. They aren't very thick, but definitely dangerous if you're not careful, and they are certainly no place for a child. Let me just remind you guys that I was barely 4 years old at the time and have no memory of any of this. I'm only repeating what my family has told me over the years. Apparently, after a few hours of babysitting, my aunt called up my parents and 911 saying that I had disappeared from the park we were at. She told them that she had lost one of her earrings and was looking for it while I was playing, and when she turned around, I was just gone. There was no one around when this happened, so the police had no witnesses, and search parties were sent out for me. My parents and grandparents were worried sick. Also, remember that it was a small town, and this was before the time when every place had a security camera around. I was found a few hours later, around 20 miles away from the park, near the woods, by a group of teenagers. They heard a crying kid, looked around, and immediately called 911. When they saw me, here's the thing, it was impossible for a kid to just wander and cover that distance. And if someone had kidnapped me, why would they just leave me in the woods? By the time I returned to my parents, I was absolutely traumatized and would not stop crying and shaking. I actually went nonverbal for a few years, and it took years of therapy. My parents actually moved to a bigger city with better doctors shortly after the kidnapping. My grandparents and parents were obviously furious with my aunt for being irresponsible, But at that point, no one suspected any foul play from her. How I ended up in the woods remained a mystery. My parents ended up distancing our family from our aunt, and so did my grandparents. My parents moving away to a new city was hard on my grandparents, and they never forgave my aunt for causing this distance in the family. My Nana, in particular, was so upset that she refused to speak to my aunt for years. This made my aunt absolutely furious. My cousin kept getting into trouble, and now my grandparents weren't there to help them out. She worked as a waitress, and I guess it was hard for her to manage everything. The first time the family got together was a few years ago when Nana fell and broke her arm. Pretty bad. My parents rushed there, and so did my aunt, and apparently there was a huge fight in the hospital. Things escalated, and my aunt accused my Nana and Pop for choosing a random kid over their own grandchild and said mean stuff like how blood can never be replaced. My aunt stormed out, and my Pops told my parents that my aunt had said similar stuff over the years when they had refused to support her financially. All this had made my grandparents suspicious about my kidnapping all these years ago, and they couldn't help but think that my aunt had something to do with it. No one had any proof, of course, so they couldn't do anything about it. My parents went no contact with the aunt. They didn't tell me any of this. I only found out very recently after the big revelation. Now for the revelation. My Nana passed away 2 weeks ago, and obviously we went back to my hometown. Mom, Dad, and I were there along with my aunt and my cousins. After the funeral service, we sat together at the house for an awkward and mostly silent dinner. Pop said that he had something important to tell everyone. Boy, when I tell you no one expected the bomb he dropped on us. My pop said that he had decided to retire completely from the family business and was hiring management to take over completely. That was actually expected, and no one was surprised. My mom and dad are realtors, and they had no intention of ever taking over, and neither my aunt or cousin were capable enough. What Pop said next, though, created a storm. He said that he was leaving everything in my name because I'm the only grandson who has shown love and respect to him and Nana. He went on to say he had never forgiven my aunt for carelessness and risking my life when I was a baby and creating irreparable distance in the family. He went as far as to say that he could never shake the feeling that she's the one who left me in the woods in the first place. My aunt went off in a fit of rage and started screaming about how they were ignoring their own grandson over a stranger's kid who will never be a real family member. At that point, she was absolutely ballistic. She started laughing like a crazy person and said, and I quote, "So what if I left him? I should have left him deeper in the woods so no one could have ever found him." When I tell you there was absolute silence at the dinner table, my mom was the first to break the silence. She asked if what my aunt had said was true. My aunt backtracked and denied it. You can imagine the scene that went on after that. Long story short, my parents went to press charges against my aunt, and my grandparents are disowning my aunt and cousin. My aunt is still trying to prove her innocence, and both her and my cousin have been reaching out to me several times with various forms of emotional blackmail, and so I may make my parents and grandparents change their minds. I am just in shock over the possibility that a family member would do something that heinous. Even though I remember noticing from the actual kidnapping, I remember years of being afraid and all the therapists I've talked to in my childhood. I have no intention of forgiving her ever. Some people are confused about why my aunt was allowed to babysit me. So, my grandparents cut my aunt off financially, but they were still a part of the family. My parents were never involved with my aunt financially, so it really wasn't unusual for her to babysit me. In fact, my mom tells me that before the disaster, no one ever suspected this. What none of them could have ever guessed is that my aunt was actually very resentful towards me. She thought that my pops and Nana preferred me over her son, who was, in her opinion, the actual grandchild of the family, and I was not real family. I guess she never made it obvious because she wanted to stay in my grandparents' good books. We're trying to take the confession to court, but it's going to be a difficult confession. None of us recorded it while obviously we were not expecting it in any way. And my aunt is denying it all, saying that she said it in a fit of rage. In her words, what she meant to say was that she wished I was never found in the woods. Not that her new statement makes it any better, but my parents have talked to a lawyer who said that without any evidence, we don't really have a strong case. Moreover, my aunt had been drinking when she said what she said. That makes it even more difficult for us to get any real justice. My parents have been in constant touch with my grandparents, and we're all going through a terrible time. Thank you for asking me how I'm holding up. To be honest, I'm still processing all of it. I mean, I was never close to my aunt or my cousin. I didn't even know that my grandparents suspected foul play in the first place. My parents only told me about all that after that night. What my aunt said about being adopted doesn't bother me at all. My parents and grandparents have shown me enough love throughout my life for me to never feel bad about being adopted. My aunt is clearly unstable and crazy if she was horrible enough to endanger a baby who had done literally nothing wrong to her. Wow, OP, you are so strong. I don't even know how I would deal with all the trauma of being kidnapped by a family member and openly being verbally abused about being adopted of all things. I would suggest your family speak to a better lawyer and definitely try to get your aunt convicted. Wishing you luck. Your aunt should be in jail. Clearly, crime is something both mother and son know very well. I admire your parents for distancing you from her even before they knew of her evil actions. You're truly blessed to have such a loving family. Am I the only one who thinks the grandparents should have taken stronger steps if they suspected foul play? I mean, I guess it's nice that they cut off OP's aunt, but this is kidnapping, for heaven's sake. The aunt should be behind bars, and that's the only acceptable punishment for her. I'm 17, female. I live with a 19-year-old woman, Kathy, and another 17 years old, Paula. Our situations are all similar, but also very different. I left home at 16 due to my mother's and sister's mental health issues, making life unbearable and the house a borderline biohazard. Paula left home due to neglect, and Kathy left foster care due to it being too unstable for her. Kathy is about 7 months pregnant with her first baby. She has something called hyperemesis gravidarum and SPD. And I don't know too much about babies or pregnancy, but I know she's really struggling, physically and mentally. I know HG is pretty much just chronic, constant morning sickness. She's pretty sensitive to smells and the sight of certain foods. I work in a small restaurant as a dishwasher and I live in Europe, so there's no tipping culture here. So whenever a tip is sent into the kitchen, it gets decided among all 5 of the kitchen staff. It rarely happens, but when it does, it's a good day. That happened this evening. We had a group of American tourists in who sent in a €50 tip, and it was split amongst us. I was really excited about this because all my money goes on bills and groceries, so I was finally able to treat myself. I got a meal from the local Thai restaurant and I was very excited for it. I got home and left it in the kitchen, and when I went to lock my cat into the room upstairs, he will try to steal my beef. In the 2 minutes it took me to get back to the kitchen, Kathy threw it in the outside bin because she said she could smell it from her downstairs bedroom and it was making her want to throw up. I got really mad because it's the first time I've been able to get myself something like that in about 6 months. And even though I didn't raise my voice, I did call her a bitch and told her I've restricted what I eat for so long to avoid making her sick. I told her this is the one thing I was looking forward to all day, and now she's gone and ruined it for me. She cried. I left the house, but Kathy called and reminded me I had promised to help her build the baby's crib this evening because it needs to get done before the baby comes. I did promise, and I hate breaking promises, but I don't want to go back home tonight. Paula texted and said Kathy has been crying and stressing all evening, which might be bad for the baby, and she thinks that's making me an a-hole for putting unnecessary stress on Kathy. AITA? Moving out, finding a different place to live, isn't an option. I'm paying 1/3 of the market rate in my area for one room, and I'm able to keep my cat. I also have a pretty great landlady, and she sent someone in to fix broken appliances within 24 hours of finding out something is broken. The only other place I'll find within the price I'm paying now would be comparable to a brothel or trap house. NTA, you aren't a hostage to your roommate's pregnancy. You aren't her life partner or family. You are her roommate, which does not mean your life has to be focused around her needs. I do commend you for leaving the house rather than staying there and potentially escalating something that is easy to do when people are being unreasonable. NTA, Kathy does sound like she's struggling a lot with pregnancy, but she doesn't get to take your food and throw it in the trash. Kathy shouldn't expect to have control over what goes on in the shared home spaces just because she's pregnant. It's very kind of you to go out of your way to accommodate her conditions, but you need to keep your boundaries. Kathy is TA, and she can't expect you to help her out with the crib after she did that to you. Basically, I've been away from work for a few weeks. We both have Apple Watches, which after a few years have a shorter battery life, so we were due a replacement. I shopped around for a little while, even thinking to change from Apple Watch to some other smartwatch. Anyway, I caved and decided to replace the watches through our phone provider, who only had a limited range of colors and sizes. I got mine, which was the same size and color, but my wife's, the only one I thought she'd like, was silver and white. So I get a parcel tracking and thought it would be a nice surprise for her to open when I knew it arrived. Being that I'm away with work, it was going to be a remote surprise. And I asked if she would open the parcel that came for me that day. Initially, she was happy that I'd surprise her that way until she opened the box and said words to the effect of, "Ugh, why did you get me a silver watch? You know I don't wear silver." This has since been turned into an accusation that I deliberately decided to hurt her by buying a watch in a color she knows she won't wear. I acknowledge that she prefers gold jewelry, But I wasn't thinking of colors, more the practical requirement that the smartwatch would be for her. I can also acknowledge that yes, I should have been more thoughtful, but I was limited in the range that was available. Now I have a $600 watch that won't be worn and an angry wife. I suppose the hardest part I can't reconcile with is that I can't think of what type of person would try to gift a surprise to their beloved with the intention of hurting them. Am I the a-hole? NaH. I had a similar experience with my husband this past week. I was feeding the baby and he offered to get me something. I asked for a bagel. I got a cold bagel. I was bummed, but thankful for food. He gets a hot English muffin with butter and honey every night before bed. I will even make it for him when he's feeding the baby. I later asked him why my bagel was cold. He froze like a scared cat and said, "I thought you liked them that way. I always see you eating them cold." I told him that while I was grateful, I eat them cold most of the time because I'm tired, starving, and don't have the patience to wait for it to be warmed up. I'm also typically in a hurry. You tried and fell a little short, and she's hurt because she feels you didn't pay enough attention. It's not the end of the world. Take it back to the store and exchange it, or change watches with her. YTA because you prioritized your grandstanding over her preferences. Rather than ask her preference for something she would be wearing every day, you thought it would be more fun to surprise her. Why rush into a decision for a utility product that you both knew would need to be replaced soon? Was her watch broken? Was there any reason other than your desire to surprise her that you went ahead without consulting her? You don't get to decide what's more practical for her when you went and bought something that clashes with her wardrobe. Her reaction implies this is not a one-off situation, but that you probably habitually minimize her wants and needs and preferences in favor of what you want to do. YTA. Although I don't think you're an AH so much as inconsiderate, using someone a gift you know they wouldn't like and won't use made it seem like you brought it to make yourself feel like a good partner rather than a gift for her. You should really know something as simple as what color of jewelry she wears. I have a colleague who does not like to eat anything blue. I make sure when I buy sweets, etc., that I get ones that have colors other than blue. It's a small, simple gesture that they like. I wouldn't buy them a bag of blue sweets and then be upset they didn't like it when I already knew they wouldn't.